I always thought summers back home would feel like a reset. Long mornings, quiet evenings, the same creaking floors and smell of coffee from my dad's worn-out percolator. But that summer was different. I was 21, a little too sure I understood life, and a little too eager to prove I didn't need to be home at all. Still, I came back. Partly because college rent had eaten through my savings, and partly because deep down I missed the silence of our old house on the hill. My dad, as always, was a man of few words. 50-something, retired early from construction, built like a wall and just as expressive. He had this way of existing that made noise feel unnecessary. Our conversations rarely went beyond dinner plans or the state of the car's oil filter. But that summer, even he seemed distracted. The first clue was the second cup of coffee he started setting on the table in the mornings. The second was when I heard him on the phone. A voice I hadn't heard in years softening in a way I didn't recognize. "Yeah, brother," he said once, almost smiling. "Place is still standing. You'll have a bed. Don't worry about it." That's how I learned his old army friend, Daniel Reed, was coming to stay. I didn't know much about Daniel except what Dad had occasionally let slip, that they'd served together back when my father still had a crew cut and a bad knee that hadn't yet betrayed him. Daniel, I gathered, was the kind of man who'd seen more of the world than I ever would. "Good man," Dad had said, which, in his vocabulary, meant something close to sainthood. The morning Daniel arrived, I was upstairs unpacking. I heard the crunch of gravel, a car door slam, and my dad's voice in the yard, low but cheerful. A tone I hadn't heard in years. I looked out the window and saw him embrace a tall, broad-shouldered man with graying hair and sun-creased skin. Daniel carried a single duffel bag, his stance casual but confident, the kind of posture you don't forget even after you've left the service. I didn't go down right away. I told myself it was because I didn't want to intrude, but really, I think I wanted to see what kind of man could make my father smile like that. Later that afternoon, after a long drive and hours of catching up between them, I finally made my appearance. "Dad," I said, stepping into the living room, "I'm heading to." That's when I saw him up close. Daniel turned toward me, and for a moment I forgot the rest of the sentence. His presence filled the room, not in an intimidating way, but in that quiet, grounded way some men have, like they've already lived through enough storms to not be surprised by rain. He had that kind of face, rugged, serious, with eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 stories and a faint scar just above his left brow. "So this is the kid," he said, voice low and steady, extending a hand. "Not really a kid anymore," I replied, shaking it, trying not to sound defensive. He smiled a little. "No, I suppose not." His handshake was firm, his palm calloused, the kind of hand that belonged to someone who'd built things and broken things with equal purpose. For the next few hours, he and Dad reminisced about army days, deployments, and nights sleeping under the stars in places they both refused to name. I half listened, half drifted in my own thoughts. There was something about Daniel that unsettled me. Not fear, not intimidation, just a strange kind of awareness. Like the air shifted when he entered a room. By evening, the house had quieted. Dad went out to the shed to check his tools, and I took the chance to shower before dinner. The pipes groaned like always, the mirror fogged up, and for a few minutes, I was lost in the comfortable rhythm of home. I just stepped out of the shower, towel wrapped loosely around my waist, when I heard the door creak open. I turned and froze. Daniel stood in the doorway, halfway through a sentence that died on his tongue the instant our eyes met. "Oh, sorry, I thought this was—" He stopped himself, turning his face slightly as if to give me space. For a moment, neither of us moved. Steam curled between us like a curtain. I could feel the droplets of water cooling on my skin, the faint hum of the light overhead. My heart beat loud in my chest. His gaze wasn't intrusive or cruel. It was startled, yes, but there was something else behind it. Recognition. "It's fine," I muttered, clutching the towel tighter. He nodded quickly and backed out, closing the door behind him. I stood there for a while, breathing hard, staring at my reflection in the mirror. It wasn't the embarrassment that rattled me. It was how his eyes had looked in that split second. Not like he'd caught me off guard, but like he'd been caught, too. Dinner that night was quiet. My father didn't notice anything, too busy talking about fixing the cabin roof with Daniel's help. Daniel, on the other hand, barely spoke. Every now and then, our eyes would meet, and we'd both look away. When I went to my room later, I told myself to forget it. Things like that happened, accidents. He didn't mean anything by it. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me, the scene replayed again and again in my mind. That door opening, that look, that strange, wordless pause that felt longer than it could have been. It wasn't lust, at least I didn't think it was. It was more complicated, more human than that. Like two people suddenly realizing they'd stepped into a space neither of them expected to share. I rolled onto my side, pressing my face into the pillow. The house was still, except for the faint creak of the floorboards in the hall. Daniel moving to his room, probably just as uneasy as I was. The rational part of me wanted to laugh it off, to tell myself I was reading too much into nothing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something in the way he'd looked at me. Not desire, not guilt, but understanding. Like he'd seen something in me I hadn't yet dared to admit to myself. Sleep came slow that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image. Daniel in the doorway, his expression frozen between apology and something else. Something quieter. Something I couldn't name yet. And as the clock ticked past midnight, one thought kept echoing in my mind. The way his eyes lingered, just for a heartbeat longer than they should have. Whatever it was, it had already begun. The days that followed were ordinary in appearance, but something beneath them had changed. A quiet, invisible current running just under the surface. After that morning encounter, Daniel and I spoke little, at least at first. My father seemed to sense nothing, too preoccupied with work and the half-finished porch that had been leaning forward for years like a tired old man. He started leaving early for job sites out of town, his truck rumbling down the gravel drive before sunrise. That meant long hours of silence at home. Daniel and I alone, the house echoing with the sound of hammers, saws, and distant thunderclouds that always seemed to be gathering somewhere beyond the tree line. At first, I thought the space between us would make things less awkward. Instead, it did the opposite. We spent whole mornings side by side, sanding boards, measuring planks, painting the railings that had long peeled from neglect. Daniel worked methodically, never rushing, never raising his voice. He moved like a man who understood that patience was its own kind of strength. Watching him was oddly calming. The way his hands guided each nail precisely, the way he wiped his brow with the back of his arm, the faint scar that ran along his forearm, pale against tan skin. He caught me staring once. "What?" he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Nothing. You just make it look easy." He chuckled softly. 40 years of habit will do that. You start thinking in straight lines and steady hands. There was something about his voice, low, warm, steady, that made even the air feel different. When we took breaks, we'd sit on the porch steps with 2 glasses of lemonade. He'd tell stories about places I'd only ever seen in textbooks. The desert heat that could melt the soles off your boots, the sound of helicopter blades that never quite left your ears, the loneliness of coming home to no one waiting. "Was it hard?" I asked one afternoon, after he mentioned a marriage that hadn't lasted. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the trees. "Harder coming back than being gone. Out there, things made sense. You followed orders. You protected people. Home. You're supposed to know how to be human again. I guess I forgot." His words stayed with me long after. Sometimes, when we worked, I'd notice small things about him. The way his fingers brushed sawdust off my shoulder without a thought. How he always let me go first through doorways. How his eyes softened when I laughed at one of his old war jokes. I started looking for those moments, waiting for them, even though I knew I shouldn't. There was comfort in his presence. A safety that felt different from what I'd known before. He wasn't loud or demanding. He didn't try to teach me lessons. He just was solid and quiet, like a part of the house itself. One evening, the sky turned dark faster than usual, heavy clouds rolling in like bruises. My father had called to say he'd be staying overnight at the site. "Don't burn the place down," he joked. When the first drops of rain hit the roof, Daniel and I brought the tools inside. The power flickered once, twice, then steadied. I lit a small lamp while Daniel rummaged through the cabinet for a bottle of whiskey my dad kept for occasions. "This counts, doesn't it?" he said, raising it with a smirk. "Only if we survive the thunder," I replied. We sat at the kitchen table as the storm began, rain drumming against the windows, thunder rumbling like distant artillery. Daniel poured 2 glasses, neat, no ice, and handed me one. The first sip burned, but it was the kind of burn that stayed warm in your chest long after. He talked about his daughter then, a teenager he hadn't seen in almost 2 years. "Her mom moved states," he said quietly. "Told me it was better if I gave her space. Guess she was right." I didn't know what to say. There was a grief in his voice that didn't need pity, only understanding. "She'll come around," I said softly. "You sound like the kind of dad who'd wait forever." He looked at me for a long time, then smiled faintly. "You remind me of who I used to be, before the world got complicated." That sentence hit harder than the whiskey. For a moment, the storm outside felt distant, the whole room drawn tight between his words and my breath. I looked down, tracing a ring of condensation on the table with my finger. "I'm not sure who I'm supposed to be yet," I admitted. "That's the good part," he said. "You still get to choose." Our eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither of us looked away. It wasn't electric or sudden. It was quiet, like 2 currents finally finding the same direction. The air shifted. The rain softened to a hum. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stayed caught behind my teeth. Instead, I laughed lightly, breaking the moment. "Guess I'll drink to that." He smiled, but his eyes said something different, something I wasn't ready to name. As the night went on, the bottle emptied halfway. We talked about everything and nothing. Favorite meals, bad movies, how small towns never really changed. But beneath every word, there was that same low hum, tension wrapped in comfort, a question neither of us dared to ask. At one point, our hands brushed when we reached for the same glass. It was accidental, but neither of us moved right away. His skin was warm, calloused, real. "Sorry," I murmured. He shook his head slightly. "Don't be." The rest of the evening passed in small gestures. The way he refilled my glass before his own. The way his eyes lingered when I laughed. The silence that grew heavier every time we said goodnight but didn't move. When I finally went upstairs, the mirror above the sink caught both our reflections. Me standing in the hallway, Daniel behind me, just a few feet away, cleaning up the glasses. For a moment he looked up. Our eyes met in the reflection. Neither of us turned. Neither of us spoke. He set the bottle down, quietly, almost reverently, and walked toward the hallway light switch. The glow dimmed until only the faint shimmer of lightning lit the edges of his face. "Sleep well," he said softly. I nodded. "You too." I went into my room, but my heart didn't settle. I could still feel the echo of that shared space, the warmth of his voice, the unspoken pull that now lived between us. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling as thunder rolled far away. I told myself it was nothing, admiration, respect, gratitude. But even as I tried to believe it, I could still see his eyes in that mirror. Not staring out of desire, but something quieter, understanding, maybe even longing. And somewhere in me, something began to shift. A realization I didn't yet have the courage to face. That night, I learned that closeness can be louder than touch, and silence can speak louder than words. I turned over, trying to sleep, knowing I wouldn't. Downstairs, I heard the faint clink of glass. Daniel cleaning up alone, and then, nothing but the steady rhythm of rain on the roof. The house had never felt so small, and the distance between us had never felt so close. The next night, the storm came back worse than before. Thunder rolled across the hills like the sky was being torn in half, and the kind of rain that doesn't just fall. It slams, battered against the windows until the glass trembled. My father was still away, staying near the job site until the weekend. That left the house to just the two of us again. Daniel had been working outside most of the afternoon, covering the lumber pile with a tarp, making sure nothing got ruined. By the time he came in, his shirt clung to his shoulders, damp and heavy, his hair darker from the rain. "Storm's gonna take the whole roof if it wants to," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Then I guess we'll just let it," I replied, trying to sound lighter than I felt. The power flickered once, then again, and then went out completely. The sudden darkness swallowed the room, followed by that stillness that only happens when electricity dies. "Stay put," Daniel said, voice steady. I heard him moving through the dark, the sound of drawers opening, the strike of a match. A few seconds later, warm candlelight filled the space, soft, golden, unsteady. He set one candle on the table, another on the counter. The shadows danced across his face, catching the lines of time and the quiet sadness that sometimes lived there. "Well," he said, "guess we're having an old-fashioned night." I smiled. "You mean no phones, no distractions, and just conversation? Sounds terrifying." He chuckled, and it was the kind of laugh that made everything feel a little less heavy. We ended up sitting at the kitchen table again, the same one we'd shared whiskey over the night before. The rain drummed against the roof, a rhythm that matched the flicker of the candlelight. Daniel pulled a small box from the shelf, an old record player, the kind with a crank and a few vinyls that probably belonged to my father decades ago. He placed one on, and a slow, crackling tune filled the room. Faint, worn, but beautiful. "I didn't know this thing still worked," I said. "Old things tend to surprise you when you give them the chance," he replied. We talked for hours, about everything from music to the meaning of peace. I told him about school, how I wasn't sure if I was studying what I really wanted, and how I felt more lost at 21 than I thought I was supposed to. He listened quietly, hands folded, eyes steady. He had this way of listening that made silence feel safe, like he wasn't just waiting to speak but trying to understand every word. When it was my turn to ask, I said, "What about you? Do you ever regret anything?" He hesitated, swirling the amber in his glass before answering. "Regret." He took a slow breath. "Only that I've loved the wrong people at the wrong time. Sometimes both." I looked at him, candlelight catching the faint scar on his cheek, the way his jaw tensed as he said it. "Wrong people?" I asked softly. "Not wrong," he said. "Just people I wasn't supposed to." Something in his tone made the air between us shift. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, the thunder closer. The record ended, the needle scraping gently before falling silent. I didn't get up to change it. "Doesn't sound fair," I said finally. He smiled faintly. "Fair doesn't enter into it." He leaned back in the chair, eyes flickering with the candlelight. "Sometimes the world tells you who you can love. Sometimes it tells you who you can't. Either way, you still do." I didn't realize how close we were sitting until the next flash of lightning lit up the room. His profile sharp, his hand resting on the table between us. Instinctively, I reached toward it, not fully, just enough that our fingertips brushed. For a second, he didn't move. Then he did, his fingers tightening slightly before pulling away, as if burned. He looked down. "You don't know what you're doing," he said quietly. My throat felt tight. "Maybe I do." "You don't," he said again, voice low, rough around the edges. "You don't know what you're asking." "I'm not asking for anything," I said. "I just don't want you to go." He exhaled, a deep sound that felt like surrender. The storm outside cracked loud enough to rattle the windows. He stood, pacing once toward the door, then stopping. His hand gripped the back of the chair, knuckles pale. "Daniel," I said. My voice shook, but not from fear. "You don't have to go." When he turned, his eyes weren't guarded anymore. They were tired, soft, filled with something I didn't yet have a word for. He came back to the table slowly, the candlelight trembling between us. "I shouldn't," he said. "But you're still here." That made him smile, faintly, like he knew it was useless to pretend otherwise. We didn't move closer, not much. Just enough that when another roll of thunder shook the house, he reached across the table and rested his hand over mine. It wasn't a question or a confession. It was something simpler, comfort, human, real. His thumb brushed once against my skin, then stopped. I could feel the warmth of his palm, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through his fingers. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel empty. Felt full. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to. After a while, the candle burned low, and the house settled into that deep hush storms sometimes bring. Like the world itself had taken a breath. I must have looked tired because Daniel said softly, "You should get some rest." "I can't sleep in this," I said, gesturing at the dark window, the wind outside. He hesitated. "You can stay downstairs if you want. I'll take the couch." "No," I said quickly. "Stay." He looked at me for a long time, measuring something invisible between us. Then he nodded once. We carried the candles into the living room. The light wavered against the walls, throwing long, soft shadows. Daniel sat on the far side of the couch. I sat near the other end. The storm kept going. The minutes stretched. At some point, we both drifted into a quiet that wasn't sleep but wasn't wakefulness either. The candle finally went out. In the darkness, I felt more than I saw. The faint shift of the couch, his arm brushing mine, the shared warmth that hummed between us. No words, no movement beyond that. Just stillness, and the sound of rain easing against the roof. When I opened my eyes hours later, the storm had passed. Pale morning light spilled through the curtains. Daniel was still there, head tilted back, eyes closed, his arm resting near mine. For a moment, I watched him. The rise and fall of his chest, the peace in his face that I hadn't seen before. I thought about what it meant, what it didn't, and how something could feel both right and impossible at the same time. He stirred then, eyes opening slowly. We looked at each other, neither speaking. There was nothing to explain, nothing to undo. He hadn't left, and somehow neither had I. When I woke up, the storm had passed. The kind of silence that follows heavy rain filled the house. Soft, damp, uncertain. For a few seconds, I didn't remember where I was. Then I felt the warmth beside me. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel. Daniel was still on the couch, head tilted back, eyes closed. Morning light crept through the thin curtains, tracing faint gold along his jaw, the lines near his eyes, the edge of his collar. For a moment, it looked peaceful, like we were part of some quiet, secret world untouched by rules or reason. And then he opened his eyes. The spell broke. He blinked once, saw me, and straightened almost immediately. "Morning," he said, voice rough. "Morning," I echoed, too quickly. We sat there in the stillness, neither moving. The storm had left the air thick and heavy, and the faint smell of wet would drifted in through the cracked window. After a few seconds, Daniel stood, stretching his arms, his shoulders broad against the soft light. "Power's still out," he murmured, avoiding my eyes. "I'll make coffee the old way." He disappeared into the kitchen. I heard the scrape of a match, the faint hiss of gas as he lit the stovetop. I stayed where I was, listening to the small, ordinary sounds, the rattle of a mug, the pour of water, and every one of them sounded too intimate now, too full of memory from the night before. When I finally joined him, he was standing by the window, watching the yard. Steam rose from 2 chipped mugs on the table. He looked over when he heard my footsteps but didn't smile. "Thanks," I said, picking up the cup. He nodded, silent. We drank in silence. The quiet wasn't comfortable anymore. It pressed down on us, thick and heavy. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know where to start. Everything I could think of felt too big for this small kitchen. Finally, Daniel broke it. "Your dad trusts me," he said, his voice low, steady but tight. "We shouldn't blur that." I looked up at him. "Blur what?" He sighed, setting his cup down harder than he meant to. "You know what I mean." I felt the sting before the words even settled. "Then why didn't you stop last night?" The silence after that was sharper than thunder. He turned to me, eyes hard but not cruel. "It wasn't supposed to happen." "It didn't happen," I said quickly. "We didn't." "You know what I mean," he interrupted. "It was enough." "Enough for what?" I said, my voice cracking. "For you to regret it? For me to pretend it meant nothing?" He stepped closer, not in anger, but in that way people do when they want to be heard. "You're young," he said, quieter now. "You don't understand how easily things get ruined." "Don't do that," I snapped. "Don't turn this into a lesson." His jaw tightened. "I'm trying to protect you." "From what?" "From feeling something real." The words came out louder than I intended. For a second, I thought he'd yell back, but Daniel just stared. That steady soldier stare that saw through noise. "I'm not your enemy," he said softly. "Then stop acting like what happened was wrong." He hesitated, his shoulders slumping. "It's not that simple, isn't it?" I whispered. He looked away. "I made a promise to your father a long time ago, to look out for you if anything ever happened to him. And last night, that wasn't looking out for you." Something inside me twisted. "You're making it sound like a crime." He didn't answer. He just ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly, the way a man does when he's fighting himself more than anyone else. "I need to get out for a while," he finally said. "Help out the Millers down the road with their fence." Of course he did. Daniel's version of escape was always work. Fixing, lifting, building. Anything to keep his hands busy so his mind wouldn't have to be. He grabbed his jacket and went outside. The screen door shut behind him with a soft creak that sounded more final than it should have. I stood there, staring at the half-empty mugs on the table. Steam still rose from one. It felt like the ghost of what we'd almost been. The rest of the day dragged. I tried reading, cleaning, even taking a walk down the old trail behind the barn, but none of it worked. Everything reminded me of him. The smell of sawdust, the echo of his voice, the faint mark his coffee cup left on the counter. By afternoon, the sun had broken through the clouds. The yard was still slick with rain, glistening under the returning light. I spotted him near the fence line, hammering nails with that same calm precision, like nothing had changed. I stood by the porch for a while, watching him. He didn't look up. Part of me wanted to go back inside and let the distance win. The other part, the louder part, told me to stay. So I went to him. He didn't say anything when I approached, just nodded toward the pile of boards beside him. "Hand me that one," he said. I did. He took it, set it in place, hammered it cleanly into the frame. "You ever build something from scratch?" he asked suddenly. "Not really. It's slow," he said. "You mess up more than you get right. But if you stick with it, eventually it holds." I wasn't sure if he was talking about the fence or something else. We worked like that for a while. Silent rhythm, passing tools, the clink of nails, the hum of insects in the humid air. Every now and then, our fingers brushed when I handed him a board. Neither of us pulled away too fast this time. When we finished, he stood back, wiping sweat from his brow. "That'll hold through the next storm," he said, almost to himself. "Good," I murmured. He finally turned to me. For a moment, there was something like apology in his eyes. Not spoken, but clear. I nodded once, letting him know I understood. We didn't talk about the night again, not then. But something unspoken passed between us. A fragile truce made of glances and small gestures. As the sun began to set, we carried the tools back to the shed. He locked the door, and I stood beside him, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice low. "For what?" "For not making it harder." I wanted to tell him it was already hard, that every quiet moment since that night felt like a wound trying to heal the wrong way. But I just nodded. He gave a faint smile, small, tired, but real. "You're a good kid," he said. "I'm not a kid," I whispered. "I know," he said, almost sadly. "That's the problem." We both stood there for a while longer, the silence gentler now. Not gone, not fixed, just bearable. When he finally walked back toward the house, I stayed outside a little longer, watching the light fade behind the hills. The world felt different now, not broken, but changed in a way I couldn't undo. Inside, I heard him moving around, plates clinking, the creak of the chair he always sat in. The sound was strangely comforting, like a heartbeat I wasn't ready to lose. That night I didn't dream, but when I finally drifted to sleep, I could still feel the faint warmth of his hand when he took the hammer from mine, silent forgiveness in the space between us. No resolution, no promises, just the truth neither of us could say out loud. The week slipped by in uneasy quiet. We'd gone back to working on the porch and sharing meals like nothing had happened. But the air between us stayed taut, stretched thin by things neither of us dared to name. The fragile truce we'd built held, until the day my father came home earlier than expected. He showed up on a Thursday afternoon, his truck crunching across the gravel drive. I was in the kitchen when I heard the door open. Daniel's voice met his first, low and calm, like always. "Didn't expect you till Saturday," he said. "Got the job wrapped sooner," Dad replied. His tone was easy, but something in it, some faint note of curiosity, made me turn toward the doorway. He was covered in road dust, smelling of sweat and motor oil, the way he always did after long days on site. Then his eyes landed on me, then Daniel, and for a moment he just studied us. Not suspicious, just aware. Dinner that night was the kind of quiet you could hear breathing through. The scrape of cutlery against plates felt louder than thunder. My father made small talk, asking about the porch, the weather, how the storm had treated the house. "Held fine," Daniel said. "We reinforced the beams." "Good," Dad replied, glancing between us. "Glad to see you two getting along." It was meant as a compliment, but I saw the way Daniel's shoulders stiffened, the way his fork paused halfway to his mouth. Couldn't eat. Every word felt like it balanced on the edge of discovery. When the plates were cleared, Dad leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly as if piecing together a puzzle he hadn't realized existed. "You're quiet tonight," he said to me. "Just tired," I muttered. He looked to Daniel. "And you?" "Same," Daniel said evenly. "Long day." Dad nodded, but his gaze lingered a little too long. The silence between questions said more than the questions themselves. After dinner, I escaped to my room. I could hear them still talking downstairs, voices low, words too muffled to make out, until one sentence broke through, clear and cold as a gunshot. "You crossed a line." The sound rooted me where I stood. Daniel's reply was quiet. "It's not what you think." My father's voice rose, sharp now, full of a hurt I'd never heard from him. "He's my son, Daniel." The words hit me harder than they should have. I didn't think, I just moved. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, they were facing each other in the living room. My father's jaw was tight, his eyes blazing. Daniel stood still, arms folded, like a man refusing to fight a battle he'd already lost. "Dad, stop," I said. He turned toward me, disbelief flickering across his face. "So it's true." I froze. The room swayed a little, my pulse loud in my ears. Daniel's voice came next, low and tired. "Let him be, Sam. He doesn't owe you an explanation." My father's head snapped toward him. "Don't you dare tell me what my son owes me. I'm not your property," I said, louder than I meant to. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dad stared at me, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. "You're defending him?" I swallowed hard. "He didn't do anything wrong. It wasn't like that." "Then what was it?" he demanded. The words tumbled out before I could stop them. "I care about him, more than I meant to, more than I should." The confession hung there between us, raw and irreversible. Daniel's face fell. My father's went white. "You're telling me," Dad said slowly, "that after everything, after I trusted him, you're standing here confessing this?" "Dad," he raised a hand, cutting me off. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do," I said quietly. "For once, I actually do." He looked at me like I'd just broken something sacred. "He's twice your age." So it's wrong," he snapped. "It's unnatural." Daniel stepped forward then, his voice steady but low. "Don't talk to him like that." My father turned on him, fury spilling over. "You don't get to stand in my house and—" Daniel didn't flinch. "You think I wanted this? You think I planned any of it? He's your son, and I respect that more than you know. But don't mistake care for corruption." Dad's voice trembled with rage. "You slept under my roof, ate my food. And you! I didn't cross that line," Daniel said firmly. Even when I wanted to. The room went dead silent. My father's eyes burned into him, then into me. Pack your things, he said coldly. You're gone by morning. Dad. No, he said sharply. You made your choice. Daniel stood still for a long moment, then nodded once. I understand. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just turned and walked down the hallway to his room. The sound of his footsteps was steady, deliberate, like someone marching toward something they couldn't avoid. I wanted to follow him, to explain, to say I was sorry for making everything worse. But my father was still there, pacing, shaking his head like he couldn't believe the air he was breathing. You're a kid, he muttered. You don't know what kind of man he is. He's better than most, I said quietly. That made him stop. Better. His voice cracked. He's been through hell. That doesn't make him fit to drag you into his. I didn't answer. There was no point. He wouldn't understand that it wasn't about age or rightness or wrongness. It was about something I hadn't even known I was capable of feeling until Daniel looked at me the way he did. When I finally went to Daniel's room, the door was open. His bag sat on the bed, half-packed. He was folding his shirts neatly, one by one, like leaving quietly might somehow make it hurt less. I'm sorry, I said. He shook his head. You don't have to be. I shouldn't have said anything. Yes, you should have, he said softly. Truth's ugly, but it's clean. Lies just rot in silence. I stepped closer. You could stay. He'll calm down. He gave a faint, sad smile. You know your father. He won't. Then I'll go with you. His hand froze mid-fold. He turned slowly, eyes full of something deep and aching. No, you won't. Why not? Because you've got your whole life ahead of you, he said. And this me would only make it smaller. I shook my head, but he went on, quiet but firm. You'll hate me one day, he said, voice barely above a whisper. But at least you'll be free to love right. My throat closed. I wanted to tell him I didn't care about right, that nothing had ever felt as honest as what I felt with him. But he was already slinging the strap of his bag over his shoulder, his decision made. Outside, rain had started again. Light, steady, the kind that soaked through everything. He paused at the door. For a second, he looked like he might turn back, say something else. Instead, he just gave a small nod. Take care of him, he said softly, meaning my father, though I heard the double edge in it. And then he stepped out into the rain. I watched from the porch as he walked down the drive, his figure fading into the gray, his jacket darkening with each drop. He didn't look back. Inside, the house felt hollow. My father was in his chair, silent, staring at nothing. I wanted to scream, to break something, to demand he understand, but instead I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, hands trembling. The window pane was cold under my fingers. Outside, the rain blurred everything, the porch, the yard, the line between what was right and what was real. And though every part of me felt cracked open, there was something else under the ache. A faint, fierce kind of peace. Because for once, I hadn't hidden. I told the truth. And even if it cost me everything, at least it was mine. By the time autumn came, the world had already moved on. But I hadn't. I'd gone back to the city for school, trading the slow heartbeat of home for the steady pulse of traffic and lectures, and everything that was supposed to make me feel like I was getting back to normal. People talked around me about finals, internships, parties, and I nodded along, laughed when I should, said, yeah, totally, even when I wasn't listening. But normal felt like a shirt that didn't fit anymore. Every quiet night, when the city softened into rain or static, my mind wandered back to that summer, to the sound of thunder rolling over the hills, the way candlelight danced against his face, the silence after he left. I told myself time would help, and in a way it did. The ache dulled into something gentler. Not pain, not exactly longing, just a space inside me I didn't want to fill. Then one morning a letter came. It was late October. I found it tucked in my campus mailbox. No return address, just my name written in blocky handwriting I knew instantly. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, heart hammering. I didn't open it right away. I took it back to my apartment, set it on the table beside my coffee mug, and stared at it like it was something alive. It had been months. He could have been anywhere. Maybe back in his hometown, maybe across the country, maybe gone entirely from my world. When I finally opened it, the paper smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. Like him. "I hope you're doing all right." I wasn't sure if I should write, but silence has its own kind of cruelty, and I didn't want that to be the last thing I gave you. I read slowly, each word like a stone placed carefully in my chest. "I wanted to tell you that you didn't do anything wrong. What happened wasn't your fault. You saw something in me I hadn't seen in a long time. Something good. For that, I'll always be grateful. I didn't stay because I respected you more than I trusted myself. I needed to leave before what was beautiful became something broken." I stopped there, reading that line over and over until the ink blurred. "Your father's a good man, even if he doesn't know how to show it. He'll come around one day. Forgive him if you can. Forgive me, too, for walking away. It wasn't rejection. It was the only way I knew to keep the best parts of what we had safe. You'll love again. Better, truer. Don't hide from it when it finds you. D." That was it. No address. No promise to write again. Just a few pages of quiet truth written in a hand that shook slightly near the end. I sat there a long time, staring at the paper until the edges curled under my fingertips. There was no anger left in me, only understanding, and a strange kind of peace I hadn't expected. For months, I'd replayed that night in my mind as something forbidden, something shameful. But now, with the distance of time and the clarity of his words, it felt different. It wasn't about desire or defiance. It was about recognition. About two people who met at the wrong moment and still managed to leave something kind behind. That evening, I walked to the river that ran through the city. Gray water sliding under bridges, streetlights trembling on the surface. The cold air bit at my skin, but I didn't mind. I pulled the letter from my pocket and read it again under the orange glow of a lamp. He hadn't said goodbye in person, but somehow, this was better. A goodbye made of gratitude instead of regret. A few weeks later, I went home for winter break. My father and I barely spoke at first, politeness pretending to be peace, but something in him had softened. He asked about school, about the city, about my friends. He didn't mention Daniel. Neither did I. Some things don't need to be named to be felt. On the third day, when the house was quiet and he'd gone into town, I walked out to the cabin behind the woods, the one Daniel and my father had worked on years ago. It had been abandoned for months now, the air inside still carrying the faint scent of cedar and dust. The place felt frozen in time, tools still hanging neatly on the wall, an old lantern resting on the windowsill. And then I saw it. Draped over the back of a chair near the door, his jacket. It was the same one he'd worn the day he left. Faded olive canvas, a small tear near the cuff, the faintest trace of tobacco still clinging to the fabric. I ran my fingers over it, tracing the seams like they were lines of memory. For a moment, I could almost see him there, standing by the window, arms crossed, smiling that small, half-lost smile of his. I sat down in the same chair and let the quiet fill around me. Outside, wind rattled the trees. Inside, everything stood still. I thought about his words. "I respected you more than I trusted myself." He'd said it like a confession, but now it sounded like a gift. Because what I realized, sitting there with his jacket in my hands, was that he hadn't left me empty. He'd left me awake. That summer hadn't been about breaking rules. It had been about learning the shape of my own heart. And though it hurt, it also freed me. When I finally stood, I folded the jacket neatly and placed it back on the chair. I didn't take it with me. Some things belong to memory, not possession. Before leaving, I looked around one last time. The light filtering through the dusty window, the faint creak of floorboards, the echo of laughter that no longer lived here. Then I whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear it myself. He walked in when I was bare, not just in body but in heart. And even after he left, something of him stayed, like light after the storm. Outside, the sky had begun to clear, streaks of pale blue cutting through the gray. I walked back toward the house, the wind cold but clean, my chest lighter than it had been in months. The road ahead wasn't simple, but it was mine, and that, finally, was enough. Years slipped by quietly, the way seasons blur when you stop counting them. Life found its rhythm again. College, work, cities that never slept, faces that came and went. I learned to live forward instead of backward, though sometimes, in the quiet corners of a day, I still caught myself tracing the edges of memory like a scar you no longer mind touching. It had been nearly 7 years since that summer, the summer that split my life into before and after. I was 28 now, working in design, living in a small apartment that looked over the same river where I'd once read his letter. I wasn't chasing ghosts anymore, but sometimes they still found me. It happened on an ordinary Thursday. I was driving through my hometown on the way to a client meeting, the kind of trip that always brought nostalgia with it. The same cracked road, the same diner sign flickering near the crossroads, Millie's Cafe. The same one Dad used to stop at after church, back when the world still felt smaller. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe because the sky was threatening rain again. Maybe because I wanted to taste something familiar. Or maybe, as I'd learn later, because some things in life find their way back to you when you're finally ready. The bell above the door jingled when I stepped inside. The smell of coffee and cinnamon hung thick in the air. A waitress smiled and pointed me toward an empty booth by the window. I slid in, ordered coffee, and let the rain start tapping against the glass. Then I looked up. Across the room, sitting near the counter with a newspaper and a half-empty mug, was Daniel. Older now, his hair more silver than gray, beard trimmed close, the lines around his eyes deeper but softer somehow. He wore that same calm posture, grounded, still, unbothered by the noise around him. For a moment, my chest forgot how to rise. He hadn't seen me yet, and I could have left, could have finished my coffee and walked out, letting the past stay where it belonged. But something in me refused. I stood, crossed the room, and stopped by his table. "You always did like your coffee black," I said quietly. His head lifted. For a moment, he looked like he wasn't sure what he was seeing. A ghost, maybe, or a memory come to life. Then recognition dawned. "Well," he said, a small smile breaking through. "I'll be damned." I smiled back, heart thudding. "Hi, Daniel." He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit if you've got time." "I've got time," I said, and meant it. For a while, we just looked at each other, both unsure how to start. The silence between us wasn't the old kind. Not heavy, not tense. Just quiet, comfortable, the way two people rest after carrying something for too long. "How've you been?" he asked first. "Better," I said. "You?" He chuckled softly. "Older, slower, happier, I think." It was strange how easily conversation found us after all those years. We talked about small things first, work, life, where we'd been. He told me he'd moved to a nearby town, ran a small repair shop now, said it was peaceful, honest work. "Guess I finally learned how to build things without breaking them," he said with a faint grin. I smiled. "And your daughter?" "She's good," he said, eyes softening. "Married now. Sent me photos of her little boy last week. First grandkid." "That's great, Daniel." He nodded, then added quietly, "Your dad? Still stubborn," I said. "Still pretending he doesn't need anyone. But we're better now." "I'm glad," he said, meaning it. There was no blame between us anymore. No need to explain or apologize. Time had done what it always promises to. It softened the edges, turned wounds into lessons. The waitress refilled our cups. Outside, rain streaked down the windows, blurring the world into watercolor. "You know," he said after a while, his voice gentler, "I used to wonder if I'd ruined your life that summer." I shook my head. "You didn't. You just changed it." He smiled, but it was wistful. "Didn't mean to." "I know." We sat there for a long time after that, just talking about everything and nothing. About the cabin that still stood, about how the porch never did collapse. About how neither of us had quite expected to live long enough to see peace look like this. Coffee in a small-town cafe, no ghosts left between us. There was no tension anymore, no trace of the storm that once haunted us. Only two lives that had grown in different directions but still bent toward the same sunlight. When it was time to go, I reached for my coat. He did the same, slower, with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to move through the world quietly. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was pale blue, washed clean. We stood by the doorway for a moment, the sound of dripping gutters filling the silence. "I thought I'd never see you again," I said. He nodded. "I didn't think I deserved to." "You did," I said simply. He looked at me then, really looked, and though the years had changed us, I saw it still. That quiet steadiness, that unspoken understanding that once turned my whole world upside down. He smiled, small, genuine. "You turned out all right. I had good teachers. Maybe one bad one," he said, half teasing. "Maybe one honest one," I replied. That earned a laugh from him, low and warm. He extended his hand, and I took it. His grip was familiar, strong but kind. Not a spark, not a burn, just warmth. "Take care of yourself," he said. "I will," I promised. He started to turn, then paused. "You know," he said, glancing back, "I still think about that summer sometimes. Not with regret, just gratitude." "Me too," I said softly. He nodded once, and then he walked away. Down the wet sidewalk, coat collar turned up, his figure fading into the soft light of late afternoon. I stood there until he disappeared around the corner. And even then, I didn't feel the ache I expected. Just calm, completion. As I walked back to my car, I realized something simple and quietly profound. Love doesn't need to last to be real. Some loves are meant to stay as moments. Not chapters, not lifetimes, but turning points. He was never mine to keep, but he was the moment I stopped hiding from myself. And that's what love really is. Not who stays, but who makes you see yourself, even when you're afraid to look. I drove away with the windows cracked open, the cool air brushing my face, the world looking softer than it had in years. The storm had ended long ago, but its light, his light, still lingered.